A new book questions whether the modern U.S. Army is fit for service. It is called Irregular Army. The premise, as the military struggled to attract new soldiers over the past decade or so, they relaxed some of their recruiting standards. America's armed forces then became populated with an increasing number of neo-Nazis, with criminals, even those that are physically and mentally unfit. Joining me is the author of the book, Matt Kennard, and retired Colonel Jack Jacobs, Medal of Honor recipient and an MSNBC military analyst. Gentlemen, I'm glad to have you here. It is an absolutely fascinating discussion we're going to have about this book. So, Matt, first up, how pervasive a problem are you alleging that this is?
Well, the figure that's often used is 1,500, but I mean, that sounds low in a military of over 2 million. But some of these people are some of the most violent and criminal-minded people in America. So if you think of it like that, all it takes is one of them to lose it on one occasion, like we saw with the Oak Creek massacre, which was carried out by a veteran of the U.S. Army from the 1990s. Tragedies like that, I mean, are rare, but the threat that they pose has increased markedly over the past decade. Okay,
now you've kind of preempted something here that I was going to pick up. But look, 1,500 you're suggesting here. Are you somewhat managing to pluck needles from a haystack? Because the U.S. military is massive. Is there an argument to be made that this book may be a very effective book-selling narrative, but it's somewhat of a distortion given these numbers?
It's not a distortion because the fact is that the U.S. military does have regulations to govern the recruitment of neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and they were completely torn up during the War on Terror because the U.S. Army was failing to recruit sufficient amount of troops. So I can understand why, from one perspective, it might look like a sensationalist narrative, but it's definitely not. And I mean, you see, it's a narrative which should shock most Americans, because the threat now, with the war in Iraq finished, well, ostensibly finished, and the war in Afghanistan winding down by 2014, is that the wars now will move back to the domestic arena, and the threat to the population of the United States is now increasing. And it's not just white supremacists and neo-Nazis. That's one that I did specific investigations into. But what's more widely known about is the huge numbers of soldiers that now have very serious mental health issues with PTSD, etc., that have been untreated and untaken care of by the U.S. military, which is also very serious.
Well, that is perhaps even an entirely separate conversation, because when you talk about the suicides and all those kinds of things, pretty deplorable numbers there. That said, Colonel, regarding the first part of our conversation with Matt, any validity to this? Do you or do any of your current military colleagues recognize this as a problem?
Well, there had been some problem in the past. Don't forget, we decided that we were going to go to war, and we required a large number of troops without having the political will to have a draft and therefore widespread service. And anytime a society does that, you're going to have to relax the standards. And for a period of time, we did have either lax standards or standards that were not followed. The people who recruit soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines into the service don't have to deal with them once they're in. Having said all that, at the end of the day, it's good leadership inside the service that solves that problem. There was some laxity in that too, but now that the requirement is for a far smaller number of people in the service, that problem has largely disappeared.
Hey, Matt, what types of soldiers did you meet while you researched this book?
I mean, I met and spoke to on the phone a lot of extremist veterans and leaders of the far-right movement who were basically saying that they were using the military to train their members for a coming, what they call RAHOA, racial holy war, back in the United States. So, I mean, they didn't see the U.S. military as a way to spread democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan. They didn't believe in the fairy tale narrative of the war on terror. What they saw the U.S. military as was a means to acquire the training in weapons, in tactical skills, in order to fight their own war back in the United States. And I mean, you mentioned Matt, the small numbers. Sorry, I just want to...
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Sorry.
Well, okay, Matt, so my question is, you also talk about convicted felons. Really? You're going to stand by that, convicted felons? And if you are saying a yes, then to you, Colonel, how do convicted felons get in the military? And do you believe they are there?
There's a requirement that people not have a criminal record, but from time to time, there have been waivers that have been issued that permit people who have certain kinds of convictions to get into the service. I'll tell you an anecdote really briefly. When I first came into the Army, we needed large numbers of people for the war in Vietnam. And it's the urban legend is really true. There are circumstances, situations in which people who were before judges got the option of either 30 days in jail or 2 years in the Army, and they selected the latter. That doesn't happen anymore. However, it's definitely true that a large proportion of the American public is not fit for military service, and from time to time they sneak through.
Is this
Can I just add something to that?
Yeah.
You said, do you stand by this? This isn't a secret. This was covered quite extensively in the U.S. media at the time. I mean, Henry Waxman, a congressman from California, was the lawmaker that basically prized this information from the Pentagon. They were hiding it, and he found, I mean, upwards of 50,000 people were recruited on what Jack refers to moral waivers, which are given to persistent criminals or felons who want to serve. Now, moral waivers do have a good purpose.
It's very important that we don't exaggerate this. There is a significant number of waivers that are issued, but a very small number of them are for persistent criminals. The large proportion of them are waivers for minor offenses. Having said all that, I'd like to see everybody in my service have a clean record, but of course that's not going to be the case.
But Colonel, is this a sort of a necessary evil because it is a volunteer military? In other words, you have to take what you can get?
Well, you know, there's a certain truth to that. Any society that wants to defend itself with an extremely small number of people, or a larger number of people, but is not willing to serve itself, is looking for trouble. And we look for trouble for the past decade as we're trying to fight wars in Southwest Asia, but without a draft, without universal service. If you're going to do that, if you're going to fight wars without widespread service, you're going to have problems like this from time to time.
Matt, I'll give you quickly the last word.
Can I give you just another example of why it became such a chronic issue? Was also because Donald Rumsfeld had this idea of transforming the Pentagon, whereby wars would be short and fought with small amounts of special forces who would then overthrow the regime, and then the US military could get out within a couple of years. That didn't happen, as we know, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So basically the Pentagon was not prepared in any way for the kind of extended deployment of huge numbers of troops. So in the absence of enacting conscription, which would have been hugely unpopular for an already unpopular war in Iraq, they turned back on changing the regulations. Now, some of those regulations were public, like they raised the enlistment age from 35 to 40, then to 42, but some of them they did by the back door, and it took investigative journalists, courageous lawmakers to uncover what was happening in the US military.
All right, guys, that's going to be the last word right now. The book is Irregular Army. We have the author there, Matt Kennard, and also Colonel Jack Jacobs. Gentlemen, thank you. And we want to point out here, we have reached out to the Department of Defense. We are still awaiting a response.